get started, please silence your cell phones if you haven't already. Also, please come back to more of our events. I left our March event calendar around this space, so please feel free to take that with you and come back. And then after our conversation here, our guest author will be signing books downstairs in the front of the store. You'll find copies of his books at the registers on the first floor, if you haven't found them already. Today, I'm so happy to welcome Paul Pines to the store to celebrate the release of his memoir, Trolling with the Fisher King, which our bookseller Maeve loved and called a wondrously wrought book of insight. Paul Pines is a teacher, a psychotherapist, and a writer, and he's published a number of remarkable novels, poetry collections, and memoirs. Please join me in welcoming him to the Northshire.
I'm going to try and do this without the mic. Am I audible in the back?
Yeah.
Am I audible?
Yeah.
Nothing if not audible. At 23, I went to sea. I learned that the roles had been open for applicants at the Seafarers International due to the escalation of the Vietnam War. I joined a dozen applicants at the Union Hall, cleaning toilets, sweeping floors, and emptying ashtrays for a few weeks until the U.S. Coast Guard issued my Z card, so called for the letter that preceded my license number, Z11928-535D1. I was licensed to work at every level, deck, mess, and engine room jobs. I boarded my first ship, the SS Wakasta, in Port Newark. When I walked up the gangway on a gray October morning in 1964, duffel on my shoulder, the seaman on watch called out, "Turn around now while you still have a chance." I spent that summer in the Gulf, on deck plates hot enough to fry an egg under the midday sun. Shuttling between Beaumont, Houston, Mobile, and New Orleans, I threw a line off the stern, freighted with the baker's impenetrable bread, which sank as soon as it hit the water. That winter on a North Atlantic voyage, in a Bremerhaven bar, a prostitute took out another woman's eye with her high heel. In front of Peter Paul Rubens' Descent from the Cross in Antwerp's Cathedral of Our Lady, St. John's red robe as he bared the weight of the wounded Christ buckled my knees. It seemed to me that everywhere I went, I sailed in the very wake of woundedness. In August 1965, I boarded the Esparta, a United Fruit refrigerator ship in Alameda. The Latino crew had looped casually between Golfito and Belize City with cargoes of bananas. They were now bound for the South China Sea. Once in Vietnam, the military kept us in country as a floating refrigerator for nearly half a year. The wounds I brought back with me would fester in others, and myself as PTSD and Agent Orange. I disembarked in Seattle to find a world I no longer recognized. The advice I heard on the gangway in Port Newark rang differently to me now. Turn around while you still have a chance. I thought I'd establish my bona fides as someone for whom this particular myth called out. This book is based on the myth of the Fisher King Amfortas, who was a keeper of the Holy Grail, and he betrayed his vow to the Grail when in the name of love he took on a challenge, killed another knight, and himself was wounded in the groin. The wound would not heal. The only relief he had was when he spent time on the back of a boat, on a lake, fishing with his line in the water. At that point, he had some relief. The myth is actually two parallel stories, or one parallel story. Amfortas the Fisher King is one half of the myth. Parsifal is the other. Parsifal is the raw young boy who becomes a knight and has to go through all kinds of trials until many years later he encounters the Fisher King and is able to ask the healing question. What ails thee? What's wrong? Parsifal encounters the Fisher King early in his career and fails to ask the question, and realizes as he leaves the Grail Castle to the hoots and jeers of those in the walls, which the Monty Python goons have made very popular in the Holy Grail, that he blew it. He blew his chance to ask the healing question. And so he has to go through 8 or 9 more years of confrontation with himself, of his own pain and suffering, until he is able and he encounters the Fisher King again. The Fisher King has gone through 8 or 9 or 10 or 12 or 15 years with the unhealed wound. And when he finally encounters him this time, because of what he has learned from his own woundedness, he not only asks the question, but the question works because he embodies the question. He knows what ails thee. He has spent time with the wound. He becomes the new Fisher King. This is a mythic structure created in the 13th century by Wolfram von Eschenbach. And the Fisher King really is the last in a lineage of wounded light bearers. Practically every culture in Western civilization has had its myth around the wounded light bearer. The light is the light of consciousness. Adam gets kicked out of Eden. He's a wounded light bearer. Prometheus drops from heaven, brings the fire of consciousness to the human race, and by night is eviscerated by birds of prey and heals during the day, the wounded light bearer. Jesus, of course, is the solar deity. He is the wounded light bearer. All shamanic traditions, the shaman is the wounded light bearer. The shaman is the wounded healer. There is no healing without the wound. If you parse out the relationship, what is required of Parsifal is to get to know his own wounds before he can heal the wound of another. What drew me to this particular myth is that in all of the mythic traditions, this may be the only myth that makes this clear. It makes clear that only by attending the wound are we able to transform ourselves to reach a point where we are capable of true compassion. This figure has been necessary for cultures all around. And I was drawn to this powerfully because so much of my life, in its experiential way, played into this. And also later as a psychotherapist and later as a poet and a writer, it was clear to me that Parsifal and the Fisher King are the same man. They're a single psyche. That Parsifal represents the conscious that must be enlarged, and the Fisher King, the unconscious, which bears the wound. And it struck me coming here tonight, the irony that what we call the unconscious is not unconscious of us. It sends us messages in dreams all the time. We're unconscious of it. What we call the conscious is unconscious of it. And so what this myth does really is, in very stark terms, delineates the progress of this relationship in a way that people in those times could read and, if not understand perfectly, feel. It then occurred to me, what happens when we lose the myth? What happens when we can no longer identify Amfortas or possible. What happens in our culture in relationship to the wound, in relationship to this potential which literally keeps our culture human, gives us access to our own humanity, particularly in a culture which does everything to avoid it, where the attention span is 50 seconds, where we invest in huge technologies to make sure we aren't aware of the wound. What becomes of that culture? This book attempts to answer those questions in part with my own personal experience and in part with an investigation of myth.